I want to kind of think about this almost as a shifting paradigm, but we're not really moving from one to another. And I don't really want to kind of think about that we are moving from this paradigm and the conversations we were having yesterday to another, because one never really stopped whilst one picked up. So I couldn't really just think of another way of doing it. But I just want to think about this as almost as a transition in some ways. And I'm just going to kind of begin really by opening up some observations. So I began to learn of you peoples here when I was a MA student in Taiwan at National Jeonju University. And I was very fortunate that I was with a group of academics, many who have shaped the field of Taiwan studies and continue to do so. Some sadly are no longer with us. So people like Bruce Jacobs would be one example who's no longer with us. But there were really kind of 5 anthropologists that I really felt that kind of helped pave my pathway, right? One is David Blundell, who was at National Jeonju University. He partially works also at UCLA. Hu Tai-li, who we spoke about yesterday, who sadly has left us. Futuru Sai from he's now at National Taidong University. He is also now the director of the National Museum of Taiwan Prehistory in Taidong. Futuru, at the time I first knew him, was the grad student of Hu Tai-li. Zhang Bing, who was at Academia Sinica, who's now at National Taidong University, the Center for Austronesian Studies, and Professor Hu Jiayu at National Taiwan University. So, I mean, we were all speaking about the conflict between National Taiwan University and Academia Sinica. I have to say I was never subjected to conflict. I had Hu Jiayu from Taida, who I worked very closely with, and I'll speak a bit about a project that I worked with her, and at the Institute for Ethnology at Academia Sinica. So I was very lucky that I didn't experience the conflict. I want to kind of really begin about a project that I began working with. So whilst I was in Taiwan, I was working with both the Remingway, the Council of Indigenous Peoples, and the Shini Museum of Foremost and Aborigines, I think is the translation of that. And I worked quite closely with both of them. And a job opportunity came up at SOAS in London. And I think the job was being targeted from somebody who was towards the end of their PhD and almost possibly into a postdoc, and I hadn't even started my PhD. But I had worked with the museum, and I kind of had an insight about what it is that they were looking at exploring. So I applied for the job, and I was invited for an interview, which was great because this was at a time where we weren't doing online interviews, and so they flew me back home. I'd not been back to the UK for just over 5 years, and I thought at most it's a good opportunity for me to learn about job interviews, and I get to go home. And so I thought this would be great. And then I was asked whether I wanted to do the job, and so I was pleased and accepted. But I realized to do this job would be delaying the start of my PhD. And I thought it's no harm in asking whether I can incorporate my PhD as part of that job. And so the job was, and it's kind of building a bit on what you were saying yesterday, David, on working with, I was working less with the Tainan Seminary, but rather on the archives of the Presbyterian Church, which SOAS is the custodians of. And what the Shuni Museum wanted to do was to work on the collection to add another layer, so to speak, on the indexing. Now, work had already begun by an archivist called Rosemary Seaton, who had already begun working on the Presbyterian archive, so was kind of adding that Taiwan or Formosa layer. And what the museum wanted would be to add an additional layer of Austronesian or Indigenous studies. So it was a case of me going through the archive and identifying aspects of that archive that pertain to Indigenous peoples, adding a kind of layer in the index. And what the museum really wanted, as many of these kinds of projects, the oral history one is example, is a good book. They like a good book. And so I was working on a book. And so what I'll do now is just going to kind of show you some photographs from that collection. And one of the interesting things, and this is the bit that kind of struck me when David was speaking about it yesterday, was that the British and Canadian missionaries, the Canadians in the north, the British in the south, were there right up until the 1940s. And then all British missionaries were expelled from Taiwan. So the archives go dark at 1940, but the archives themselves, the church itself did not go dark. It continued and it thrived, and the archives pick up, but now you see the same archives, but they're now in Taiwan. And so this was one of kind of the things that really kind of interested me, is about the way in which conversations around being in Taiwan was changing. And so I just want to kind of just share some of the pictures I was going through these last night, and I thought, okay, so some of these would be quite nice. So this is the Tainan Girls' School. This is in the kind of early 20th century here. This one here is particular. I'm not really sure if you can see it really well because it all seems to be a bit fuzzy. I've got a really lovely picture here, but I'll just talk you through it. So photographing. So this was really at that bit, the early 20th century, is when the missionaries decided that both they would work with the Southern Mission and the Northern Mission would kind of come together to begin the evangelizing of Indigenous communities. And so really this was that bit where I was adding that index layer into the archives. And so here is a newspaper cutting that was done by one of the missionaries back to England of a journey into the interior. And here we can kind of see some of the photographs from that early expedition into the interior of Taiwan. And they were sending back photographs. And here is a picture of a school that was beginning to be set up. This is a bit further in than they had set up schools previously. So the two books that kind of came out of this was the Chronicling Formosa. I think it's quite similar in many ways. There's so many layers about this idea of it becoming volumes. And I suppose also as a PhD student at that time, I thought I'm going to have all the time in the world to be able to do this kind of researching. And then you get your first academic post, and the administration just kind of stops you from pursuing volumes. I stopped at 1876. And the reason why I did this, because the archives really pick up on the Women Missionary Association. And the Women Missionary Association added a really, really new and interesting layer because of their relationships with local women. And I just felt that warranted not to just kind of be glossed over with the main Presbyterian archive of the Foreign Missionaries Committee. So what I then did, I thought I stop here in terms of the publication. So I did this, but the Council of Indigenous People, they wanted me to produce something that was less textual and more photographs, right? And so Buried Treasures came about by looking at the three lots of archives of which that there are at SOAS. One is the Presbyterian one. The other is the Swire Company, which is Cathay Pacific. It was a Hong Kong-based company, but there was a lot of trade relations. And the other is Christian Aid, which had a very interesting kind of development in the post-war period. And so these were the two books that came out of that. You can't see this, and I do apologize, but what I will do, so this was on December the 29th, 1911. So this was at the Conference of the Missionaries in Formosa, connected with the English Presbyterian Church and the Canadian Presbyterian Church. And the question of beginning Christian work among the hill tribes was discussed. And this is where it starts to outline this. The interesting thing about this is that it starts to talk about the individual groups, and then we're given their opinions on this. So here, the Ami, particularly here, have been peaceful for years. There is neither danger to workers, nor would there be an objection made by the authorities. So here would be the Japanese authorities, to the evangelization work there. And as you may know, up to 70% of Indigenous people are Christian. So we can start to see the beginning of that missionary effort. But one of the interesting things about the archive at SOAS is that it worked very closely with the British Museum in terms of the artifacts. So the letters start to talk about the exchange of objects. And this is where the work, so here is a picture here of that particular first mission out. And so I began working with Hu Jiayu at Taida to begin cataloging the Formosan collection at the British Museum. And there are about 286 items. Most of the items relate to the Japan-British exhibition in 1910, when they brought a Taiwan family to the UK as part of a living museum. And so the objects that were related to that Formosan pavilion, they remained within the UK. But the other items are the items that were collected by the missionaries themselves and then donated to the museum. And actually, I wanted to share this one with you because this one was collected from William Campbell, who was the missionary who was out on that initial journey. But the interesting thing about this one is that the cotton itself is made out of dog hair. And actually, this has raised interest with the Smithsonian Museum, who are seeking to see whether or not that there is a connection with the types of dogs that we use to create the fur here than there is in the Northwest region and here. So I'm working at the moment with the Smithsonian Museum to see whether we can DNA test this. But of course, the British Museum are all layers and layers of bureaucracy. Oh, you're going to do that. You've got to pay the conservation. We need to go through years of preservation of this, and it's going to. So, but that's a conversation between the Smithsonian and the British Museum. And so Hu Jiayu and I published a book on that collection at the British Museum. And so this started to kind of begin a journey where I began to start doing my ethnographic work on Taiwan Indigenous peoples, particularly amongst the Amis in Dulan on the East Coast. And it all kind of came to me really just through these different moments that I was having in my kind of my academic journey to the point where it is now about me working through this. But I just wanted to, I added this yesterday, so it probably will feel a little bit kind of now off topic slightly, was that David, we were saying about the archive at the Tainan seminary. And one of the most interesting things that I found there is the Church News. Now, the Church News was written in Romanized Taiyu. And one of the fascinating things is that SOAS is the only place where there is the entire collection of all of them. There is a Yale University here have part of the collection, but the condition of it is actually really bad. And so I was seeking ways to which to get funding to do a digital archive of this. It was just part of the thing that never materialized. But one of the interesting things is that typically the people who were writing for this were local people. And they were talking about their own issues that they were having in the communities. And it's kind of a bit gossipy in many ways, but it was also good about practice. And I wanted to put this image up because you were talking about yesterday about children. And so there's quite a lot on children and about different kinds of practices and, making Christian children. And it was just an interesting part of that collection. So I was looking through the things and I found the picture and I thought I would just share that with you. So just slightly kind of off topic, but kind of relates to two of the conversations that were happening yesterday. So kind of moving forward. So I took up my current position in 2016. And part of my role is to develop Asia Pacific studies within the different disciplines that we have as academics. The good thing that we do have is that we have 5 of us that work on Taiwan. We're all different in terms of the areas that we work on, but there are 5 of us whose research works on Taiwan. Our main student body are those studying Korean, followed by Japanese and then Chinese. And so we work together as a department. But because of our strength in Taiwan, we set up both the Northern Institute for Taiwan Studies and the Center for Austronesian Studies. The Center of Austronesian Studies was one of which I maintained my collaboration with the Council of Indigenous People. In 2023, en route to Edinburgh, the council, along with members of the Taiwan community, were en route to Edinburgh for the repatriation of human skulls. And so here we have them en route, and then here they were in Edinburgh. Those skulls are currently now in the Museum of Taiwan Prehistory. And Futuro was saying to me, it is now one of the most spiritually protected buildings in Taiwan, because it's over a number of different indigenous groups have cast some sort of protection around those because of we're not sure where or who the skulls are. So we do have, there's like a Sarayan one, there's a Paiwan one, there's an Amis one. Give it because it's in Taidong, so there is a number of different other ones. So just walking around the outside of the buildings, betel nuts are the key things that we just find randomly placed, and we know what they are and not to move them. So I kind of, to open up for this discussion, I just kind of want to talk about a work that I'm looking at. I briefly start to explore this in my recent book, but this is an area of development. Is to look at this Austronesian connection, the Austronesian connection that Taiwan has, to think about Taiwan in multiple narrative forms. And one is to kind of ask ourselves what Taiwan is, and then to think about what Taiwan isn't. And so these were the ways in which that I was trying to try and explore that. The question here really depends on what it is that we're really thinking about. So I started to think about Taiwan as being part of the Pacific. Taiwan is a Pacific island. It has its Austronesian connection. It is the only Chinese-speaking Pacific island. And through that, we have this kind of that Pacific connection with Taiwan. So I started to see this as being Taiwan that sits on an edge of a continent, that continent being Asia, and it sits on the edge of the Pacific. And it really depends on the kinds of stories in which that we are asking. And the questions that kind of asking is whether or not we're asking continental stories, so the story of settlement, or whether we're asking these kind of oceanic stories, which is much deeper in Taiwan's history. So I started to think about these continental stories as being something of an inbound migration, people moving to Taiwan. This is a very land-orientated way of looking at Taiwan. But then Taiwan also exists, as I mentioned, on the edge of the ocean. And this was about an outbound migration and a movement away from Taiwan. Now, this we have seen in Taiwan's deep history, this movement from Taiwan onto the Batanes Islands into the Philippines, and then the Austronesian languages have kind of branched out from that. But we also see this in its modern history with this kind of these transoceanic movements of people, you know, from Taiwan to the United States. We're still seeing that outbound movement across ocean, whether this is on ships or by plane. So these kind of continents. So with my students, I kind of ask us to think about these things about, you know, if we think about Taiwan as a continental story, what is it that we're thinking about? And I think some of the conversations that we're having yesterday very much fit within that paradigm of a continental story. And I think for many of you going to Taiwan was to study those continental stories about Taiwan as being part of an Asian continent. And I think in certain ways, so for myself, people like Karen Friedman, Scott Simon, we in many ways have started to explore other areas. Now, this is quite interesting when we're not all indigenous people in Taiwan are oceanic indigenous peoples. Obviously, you've got those who live in the mountain, very land orientated there. But this is just ways in which we're just kind of opening up this kind of conversation. So, you know, obviously, when we start to think about Taiwan and its continental stories, we tend to be thinking about this in terms of its cross-strait relations. And so one of the things I often ask my students to do in any of the topics is just do a Google image search. What comes up? What are the most popular things that people think about? And when we put Taiwan, and I think it's quite interesting, Taipei 101, it seems to be this dominant feature of its landscape. But we don't really get this sense, right? We don't get this doom and gloom when you just type Taiwan. Now, we do start to get a little bit of this kind of, these like little military images coming in. But, you know, if we were to look at, say, North Korea, for example, we did an image set of North Korea. I mean, this is just heavily dominated by conflict and one person. I mean, Tsai Ing-wen took up one image there. We wouldn't necessarily say that there's a huge cult of personality that was around her in the same way that we do in the case of North Korea. And so here I started to think about, okay, so, you know, although this dominates the, you know, the media in a way in which the media looked at, actually, it's not really how people think. When people think of Taiwan, they tend to think of Taipei 101. And so I wanted to kind of then start to think about this a little bit further and start to think, so how did we get to where we are? And so this is with John's work and looking at the kind of this island of settlement. And then, you know, this one of James Davison's famous map of the 1901 that shows this kind of demarcation between the different sides of the island. And we can see that linguistically that follows very much a similar line that we saw here with the red line in terms of the Taiwan Indigenous languages. So this other kind of narrative is these ocean narratives, is to think about Taiwan as being part of an ocean. And again, I get students often to just do ocean Taiwan, and we get just the east coast of Taiwan, right? I mean, it's just a beautiful landscape, though we do have that creeping image in the bottom, which you know, it just happens to be there. That's still just a reminder that even ocean Taiwan has still that continental story added to it. But if we type Austronesian Taiwan, we get a complete removal of any of those kinds of images or stories in which that we start to ask different questions. Now, I'm not advocating that we choose one over the other. I just say that how we look at Taiwan or how we see Taiwan largely depends upon the questions that we are asking. And so for those, obviously, who don't know, and I'm definitely not in a room that don't within this, but for those who don't, you know, here we have the extent of the Austronesian languages. So just a bit kind of about how we got to where we got to. But this reminds me of a visit in 2015 by a group of Maori writers. And Witi Imahira, he is a writer who wrote a book called The Whale Rider. And my conversations with him have been quite lasting. And one of the things that he spoke about, so he wrote Whale Rider, but he didn't necessarily have this idea. And he was talking about this afterwards, that this notion of Taiwan as being Hawaiiki, this kind of land of the ancestors. And so this land that Taiwan is this kind of almost a liminal place. It's a geographical kind of area of which they know that there's the linguistic descendants from, but also this place of this ancestral place. And so he's quite a big advocate for this idea of Taiwan as being this cradle for Austronesian languages and by extent languages spoken by people, and so by that Austronesian people more generally. And then I started trying to explore, it's like beyond just languages, that there are other evidence that could perhaps indicate Taiwan as a kind of a homeland of Austronesian culture. You know, Austronesian is a language family. We don't talk of ourselves as being Indo-European people, but can we talk about Austronesians as being a culture, a group of people? And so I've looked at paper mulberry tree, the making of bark cloth as part of this. And so bark cloth throughout the Pacific is often known as tapa, and this is largely to do with the sound it makes. But it was in 2015 when this paper came out that really kind of struck me the most. And so I'll just kind of give you an idea here, is this CP17, which is a genetic marker that's found here in Rapa Nui, so Easter Island. It's also found in Tonga, Fiji. But if we look in Taiwan, it's right here in Dulan. So it's this. So genetically, this is the tree. Now, this is not done by paper mulberry trees. Can't be germinated, is that possibly the right way, by seeds. It has to be by seedlings. And so this means that for it to have been here, it needed to have been carried. And then to carry it, there is a purpose for carrying it. And one is the use of making cloth. So I wanted to kind of look at that a bit more further. And this is where it becomes really interesting, because obviously we know Madagascar is an Austronesian language, but Congo is the only area where bark cloth is a UNESCO tangible cultural heritage. And its roots into Uganda and Congo come through via Madagascar. So this idea of what Jared Diamond says, Taiwan's gift to the world, right, actually goes much further than just purely the languages of Austronesian. And so here, right here in Dulan is where this tree is, and Siki is a bark cloth maker. And so every year I bring my students, and here they are making bark cloth from probably not the original tree, though I like to have the Newton apple idea in my head, but it's probably not the original one. But here it is. It's harvested. You take down the branches, you take down one, two grow back. So it's a very sustainable way of making cloth. And so we've been doing it every year. So obviously here is a younger pre-COVID version of myself. And so the making of bark cloth is something that we do in practice. And so last year, the Taiwan Indigenous TV came to interview my students. And so in that interview, the students talk about kind of like the enjoyment of being in nature and working with bark cloth. And so I've gone beyond this and started to think about this much wider connection. So in 2018, I curated an exhibition called Woven Austronesia, whereby we invited the Fijian diaspora to come to Preston. Now, I have to just remind you, this is an old Victorian library in the northwest of England in the middle of winter. I was freezing cold and I just had my shirt on, but you know, everybody else was like that. So I have no idea why they were just not as cold as everybody else. And so here we were as part of this exhibition to actually explore this kind of connection of textiles throughout the Pacific. And these are just some photos from there. The following year, because of COVID restrictions, we couldn't go to Taiwan, but Taiwanese people could come, providing they did their 2-week back in when they came back to Taiwan. So we brought them to the UK to continue our bark cloth workshop. And that kind of brings this kind of end of just some ramblings that I have in terms of these ways in which that we're moving towards things. And I'd kind of like to kind of open it up to perhaps for you to kind of talk about your own experiences of doing ethnographic field work in Taiwan and your kind of ways in which that you worked around issues of indigeneity, and perhaps kind of thoughts and reflections on directions that maybe you would take now if you were to start all over again. I'd be very keen to know about, if you were to start all over again, what would you now go to study? But anyway, so I'm going to stop talking, and I would like to kind of open this up more broadly now.
Just a quick question. There's been a lot of work, of course, on sweet potatoes and all of that.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of overlay with the bark cloth? That's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, so sweet potatoes has always been a really fascinating one because we don't have evidence about when it began. So it was introduced by the Spanish, but there's no record. We don't have a record of that. We know that sweet potato is not, it's a tuber, so it's not going to like bob along the sear and then find it planting. Thor Heyerdahl's idea of movement, or at least connections between Peru and Easter Island, Rapa Nui, might well be. He at least demonstrated that you could do it, though we know linguistically it came from the Asian continent, not from the Americas. But the idea that the sweet potato may well have been part of an early trade network, that's possible. We just don't know that. But by the time that the British were going around and the French were going around, sweet potato was very widely used throughout the Pacific. We just don't know.
with it. Might be something that overlays with the bark cloth.
Yeah.
The drop to the Congo is absolutely stunning.
Yeah, so the genetic data on the sweet potatoes, it comes from South America. So we know that that's where its origins are. We just don't know how that came from there to the Pacific. As the two hypotheses, one is that it was Spanish, but it's undocumented. It might have been just done by error. We don't know. Or there was other earlier systematic trade, which a number of people, particularly on Rapa Nui, do talk about these kind of connection. And this was where Tor Heyerdahl, he postulated that that's where the movement of people came. He built the raft and crashed it, but at least he made land, right?
Niki, I really enjoy your presentation. I think it's fabulous stuff. Kind of go in 3 different directions, and I have things to say in 3, but I'll just pick several. 2, I think. One is this question of the oceanic narrative versus the continental. I think that's sort of pretty interesting. If my memory serves me correctly, that has some resonance because in Taiwanese historiography, there has been the talk for the longest time. And this entire field was pioneered by historian Cao Yongke, which is Haiyang Taiwan, the oceanic Taiwan. And of course, I think what you're proposing is something different, right? Because it's sort of, based on your work, anthropological work on the Austronesian diaspora and everything. But Haiyang, the oceanic Taiwan in itself is more still, I think, a little bit continental. And because it has to do with Taiwan, again, being an island, so there's this trade, right? But the trade is mostly opened by, colonial settlers from China and later on by Western Europe. So I'm just wondering, right? So are you trying to develop something that's entirely different already from this oceanic sort of Haiyang Taiwan narrative, or you're looking for something that's sort of a mix between the two? Because I'll give you an example. Again, long story short, I've been working on the project on a group of refugees that were actually by the nationalists from southern Taiwan. These are the Dachshund people. Of course, they're part of that mainland or exodus because that's a very diverse population. 18,000 fishermen. And basically, they're fishermen. So these are seafaring people. So again, long story short, the entire project to resettle that with U.S. money, it was actually the U.S. 7th Fleet that went to Dachshund, 5 carrier groups and 300 ships to basically provide cover for them to go to Taiwan. And then the thing is that the biggest point, when I was listening, because I already wrote 2 articles, chapters it's going to be published. But when I listened to you, right, in terms of this oceanic, I was like, yeah, why don't I see that? Because these are seafaring people. And the reason why the initial thing, program is settled that failed is because we don't treat them as oceanic people. And these are, U.S. imperialists and, like Americans and the nationalists, they kind of see this resettlement as a developmentalist project with these refugees out of poverty. And of course, that's pretty continental center, right? And it's pretty settler imperialist ideas. So, I mean, again, long story short, later on, the reason why these people become successful is the National Development Program for them to become seamen on Taiwan's international trade when Taiwan's economy took off there. So I could totally sort of envision something. The point being that it is not completely in the new aspect you're talking about, but also incorporates something that's important for oceanic Taiwan. What do you think about this? I know this is a very, very long question. I'm sorry, but this is what I'm actually thinking about. The kind of the thing that can be beneficial towards at least my existence. I apologize for that. So I'll keep it at that. I know it's a question.
Yeah, thank you, Dominic. So I think in many ways, I just think it in almost like in layers, not necessarily. I know I had to present it as two narrow like this. Yeah.
Contrasting
But I think it's in layers. It's always just fascinated me about the Taiwan as an island, but there is a fear of the sea, right? So I'd always thought about Taiwan as a seafood culture. So it eats the food from the sea, but doesn't necessarily. It doesn't have a mindset of ocean. Not necessarily everyone is an island, obviously, as we all know, an island of many differences, right? But it always just kind of just interests me that if we think about the building of apartment buildings, we don't get ones where there's a demand for a sea view. They would argue, oh, that's because we have typhoons, or there's hurricanes that go right across the parts of Florida, but everyone still wants to have that sea view, right? So I've never really took that as an answer, but it always just fascinated me that there is this fit. A lot of that comes from this kind of very continental or very land way of thinking. And of course, there's always going to be examples that will go against that. But it was just ways in which that I started to think about how do we start to write or understand a Taiwan that's deeper than this notion of its 400 years of history, right? And for me, it's within its relationship to the ocean, or we could have another one on its relationship to mountains, right? But for me, it's looking at ocean. And its relationship to ocean is a way in which that we can start to explore that kind of interconnectivity of a history of Taiwan that's deeper than this 400 years that we're often told that is the history of Taiwan. By having something more open and inclusive, whereby there were people already here prior to the 400 years.
Sorry to sort of interject you, I think, again, I can see that there's a lot of potential for this kind of perspective. Because we have to North Taiwan, Okinawa, South Taiwan, the Philippines. The oceanic connections between different communities are actually on Taiwan, including what we call the maritime, people of the European drive. Right? Of course, we don't have words, but we have archaeological evidence to be able to study something like that. And I never see anything like that in Taiwan studies because of the lack of this kind of imagination you actually provided us here. So, yeah, thank you for that. This is, I really got a lot of what you're saying. Thank you.
Well, 2 or 3 questions. I hope don't take too long. Let me ask the simplest one first. They're wearing this bead. And I was in Shuiman, right, in Sunday night where the artist colony there. There was a gentleman, I think, named Wuhan, is that right? And he had a bead factory. And I asked him, well, where do these come from? And he said he thought somewhere in the Mediterranean, but he wasn't sure. Is there that's my simplest question, is there a way to trace the beads, which are definitely an indigenous Taiwan thing? But it's like sweet potato.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing. So this was the game, so the book I have is actually a book of kind of lots of unfinished things that I began, and COVID hit, and the book tried to see if it was going through boxes to get the chapters that became the book. And I began one looking at the transaction of beads. So European missionaries were trading beads for indigenous objects, things that fascinated them that they could bring back home and show. And so the use of kind of beads in indigenous artifacts became more popular as a result of the trading in the beads. And then that started to kind of make their own versions of that. But there is this, we do have this evidence of where beads were part of an early trading, particularly on the southern parts of which is where we've got Taiwan, and which this is a Taiwan bead.
Yeah. Something much more general and philosophical. I was just looking up, I remember in the 1990s when people were, any meeting or anything you went to with Taiwan was all about identity. You know, what is Taiwan? There was a scholar called Wang Wanshou, wrote a book called Taiwan Luan. And, but then he wrote a much more interesting book called Zhongguo Luan. It's about the difference between continental cultures and oceanic cultures. Continental cultures are insular, they're conservative, they build walls, great walls, and all this. And the oceanic peoples are open and they absorb, everything from everywhere and make it their own and adapt and adopt. And so it was a way of promoting a sort of Taiwan nationalism through this sort of, oceanic psychology or something like that, as opposed to the continental thing in China. And then at the same time, Elon which was one of the cradles of the Taiwan and eventually the DPP, they were consciously promoting, and my student Rushini, who's now at Taida, wrote a dissertation on this, that through architecture, the multicultural nature of this Elon place. And so they had a bridge which was tile, sort of basket weavers, in the motifs of the bridge. And then they had a Gabalan house, which was supposed to take the ecological principles from Gabalan traditional knowledge and put it into modern agriculture. The national at the library was a Suzhou style compound of sort of traditional Jiangnan gentry. The building, the administration building was an ordinary hollow, Minnan house with flat bricks, and then there was something else, I forget what it was, but it was the old Japanese officers club. So they had, Chinese, Minnan, Japanese, style, Gabalan, and this was a very different kind of nationalism than the sort of what KMT was promoting, we're all Chinese. And it wasn't rejecting Chinese because they had the Minnan, they had the Suzhou, but they were, saying, well, Chinese is just part of it.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me that was a very salubrious kind of nationalism. It wasn't a nationalism because we're excluding everybody else, but a kind of nationalism that we're including, a wide strain. And I don't know what, obviously they should have put something American in there too, but I don't know exactly what they did.
The refrigerator.
Yeah.
The direction they drive walk.
Yeah. But, is this, is the inclusion of indigeneity and oceanic culture in this, is this a kind of a, kind of nasty cultural appropriation for purposes that have nothing to do with the good of the indigenous peoples? Or is it a legitimate way of trying to, unite the country, which after all has been very split, ever since 1895. But even before that, Zhangzhou people were feuding with Quanzhou people. So what do you think about this sort of strain of nationalism, and where does it sit now? Because I'm kind of out of the discourse right now.
Yeah. Do you mind if I ask you to respond to that? Because I think probably it's better.
That is the question that always in my mind. Yeah, well, I'm so happy that you asked the question, and because as the indigenous person in Taiwan, learning how to be an indigenous person in Taiwan, because I was born in the urban area and I don't have this strong background to the community, but on this process, people keep asking me, like, how do you see yourself as the Taiwanese, as the indigenous person, as anyone, and especially now, the nationality is always a sensitivity topic because of the threats we all know. Yeah, so sometimes we feel that this narrative, like this oceanic narrative, it somehow put Indigenous person on the spot that you are a symbol of Taiwan is different from China. Yeah, so we know this, and so, but we also know that because of this narrative, we also got a chance to have more resources to build our community work. Yeah, because whenever now we are applying for funding, applying for project, because of this narrative, so we got more chance to be seen. So I think sometimes we say that okay, the government has their own agenda, like DPP has their own agenda, why they see us. And sometimes when they have like this national ceremony, they will definitely ask Indigenous people to come to the opening ceremony to demonstrate that now Taiwan is a country of multicultural, and we highly see you, the Indigenous person, very important. Yeah, so we need to find a delicate balance of how we do it, because we don't want to only be a symbol, but we want to use this chance to regain more power of how we do ourselves. I really appreciate this question and thank you inviting me to share some of the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. This interesting and provocative. So that coming into Taiwan studies from another perspective. I teach in the School of Indigenous Study in Taiwan University. So that narrative really is a daily life of our teaching. But I also have the issue of thinking about that because probably derived from what Dominic says. The continent narrative and oceanic narrative seem to be polarized in some time, but they do have some interweaving process. But I mean, when we talk about when you give the evidence talking about maybe sweet potato or the mulberry tree barks, and that remind me something about the blood, has all the content in the plant Binghuzu's, background, and that all of a sudden, all Taiwanese people claim they have the Binghu origin. Everybody become indigenous, which can be another polarized way. And I mean, I think that goes back a little bit to our discussion yesterday to recontextualize this narrative into Taiwan's political and social condition in between the post-war and up to maybe late or mid-80s when the indigenous movement coming out. In between that, there's still a lot of things coming out in the indigenous people, but we don't actually understand or working with them like we do, like the Japanese did in another way, or how we have already imagined the people like oceanic, the fellows. So I think there is a missing connection in between when we think about the oceanic way and the continental way here. That I think may be something we can, get a little more in the Taiwan study reflection here. That's what I vision here. Thank you.
You talked about the Presbyterian archive, but you didn't talk about Presbyterians very much. They've been a force there for more than a century. And I'm kind of curious for an update. We talk about this identity thing. What about the whole Presbyterian piece? What was their perspective? What is their perspective? What are the perspectives of indigenous communities that are largely Christian or largely not Christian still? For a long time, when I was in Taiwan, it was the Presbyterians that were kind of protecting Aboriginal identity from the government in a funny kind of way. So I'm kind of curious for an update about that.
Yeah, so I think his position as protected is something that it continued up through the post-war period.
Probably to the end of martial law.
Yeah, and then even to some extent that continues now. It was part of with the post-war period, other Christian denominations began moving to Ireland that had much stronger conservative views, many of them coming from the United States. But so, for example, the conversations around same-sex marriage, Presbyterian church took a much more of a progressive viewpoint on that, which was a very interesting perspective because we don't necessarily see that amongst other Presbyterian churches elsewhere, particularly in the African continent. But it took that particular role. And so we saw it in terms of this idea of the protection of so we saw that, and there's continuations of the promotions of the Romanization forms of that. We see this as the main denomination amongst Indigenous groups. But it is quite interesting that it does cross over political divides. We have many Indigenous communities tend to vote blue rather than green. Scott Simon's book, Truly Human, kind of begins to kind of start unpacking some of that and the reasons for this, that Hopewell people want land, KMT people want votes, and we much prefer to give them our vote than give them our land. And so that has is one way of looking at it. But you do see it kind of crossing over political divides in terms of the different church, but the role of the church does continue to play that, but it's very much now a Taiwanese church. The missionaries that returned in the post-war period, particularly the David Lansborough, which was one of the key ones to come in Zhonghua, we really didn't see we saw the movement take off, which is what we saw in both the Tainan Seminary Archive as well as the one in Yangmingshan. We see just this continuation of it just becoming a local church and local hospital.
Time it arrived up until very recently was the fact that it was associated with foreign power.
Yeah, foreign power and imperial power. After the war, the Americans, you wouldn't really want to fool with the church too much because it connects to America. And that all connects. So that it sounds as though that is becoming, I won't say it's deteriorating, it's becoming correct.
I think it was one of the things that when missionaries began returning, it's at 46, 47, many of them just said that we're not needed here anymore. The church is now a local church. It was because of the continuation of it during the war period.
Connection with the United States, particularly, but also with Britain during the KMT period was still.
Yeah. So the Presbyterian then became part of the United Reformed Church. So we had kind of more than one coming together, and so missionaries were still there, but they were playing kind of particular kind of roles. So this is where we start to pick up things like Christian Aid. So it was very project based. So the churches were sponsoring particular projects. So this could be buildings. So there's that whole thing around, I think it's called Blackfoot, this thing about arsenic pollution. And so there were these clinics looking for treating of Blackfoot. So this is one of the things that we started to see. So they were very specific so the role that the UK was particularly that moment there. The Canadians had a very different role, and obviously with the split between Britain and Canada, we don't see anything of the Canadian stuff in the UK. But the archive starts to kind of really fizzle out basically in the post-war period. We just don't really see anything in there.
I read an article called From Barbarians to Sinners. About,
Lovely title.
The early successes of the English and also the Canadian Presbyterian Church were in Plains Aboriginal villages. Han people had no use for Christianity or missionaries. But the Plains Aborigines were sort of suppressed peoples, Austronesian peoples, were, impressed and anxious to hook into, an English church that had connections to foreign power, that gave those communities some sense of protection against Han encroachment. So the early successes, and to this day, some of the oldest congregations of the Presbyterian Church are Soraya villages, Soraya churches. Mm. And in late June, I was at a Presbyterian church up in the mountains in Eugene, Soraya community coming together to listen to a presentation from Chen Shuzhuo about the process of getting a national level recognition. The Soraya are already recognized by Taiwan, which is city, I guess, and can get funding for cultural projects from Taiwan, but cannot get it from the national level. And of course, at the national level, there's competition for these resources, and Plains Aborigines are looked at questionably by the other recognized indigenous groups as, one more way in which their resources might be diluted. But in any case, those congregations are still alive and they're very much a product of the first 50 years of the English and the Canadian Presbyterian Church were focused in these villages on the West Coast. And there were exploratory visits into the East Coast and the mountains, but no real advancement of by building congregations.
It sounds as though there's still a little bit of a political shadow.
Perhaps. But the other thing I'd like to report is that, when I first started interviewing Plains Aborigine groups and Soraya in particular, they were not particularly anxious to have their non-Han origins, broadcast. And, they were, somewhat ashamed of their identity. And, they're generally poorer than their neighbors, and, other things. And, they're the subject of, these catcalls from, Wana, called by their neighboring villagers. So, or they have a history of that. A history that their parents, tried to transcend, by not emphasizing their difference. But so I was at a dinner with a lunch, where we were interviewing an older generation. They talked about, well, we used to walk down the valley to our school, and the Han kids would yell out "Wana." It's all very bad. And his son, who's a taxi driver in Tainan, had come back to the village for Sunday dinner or something. Said, "What? What? We're not just Taiwanese? What are you telling me?" And the parents had never transmitted, this history because it was shameful. But today, after martial law and after the opening up, the identity movement and the pride in being Plains Aborigine and this notion that there are now these books on do-it-yourself. How do you find out if you have Plains Aborigine ancestry? Are on the shelves, and they're now proud of this background and wanting to have an identity. So it's actually wonderful from my point of view is that these people are no longer ashamed. They're proud. They're happy to be, but they are leery of being used by political interests, to manipulate that identity for other groups. So, that's here. So,
I think it would not be terribly difficult to find information about resources that were sent by these various missionary groups and later the state entities that disperse money if you sign up and register as stuff. Yeah, Why does, and I am asking this honestly, why does one have to go all the way around the barn to get to what supports such things and causes people to change their ideas that okay, we used to be really looked down on and we used to be attacked and blah, blah, blah. And now we're given stuff, so we must be, we can be proud of ourselves. I don't see why we need to go around the barn with all this identity stuff before you look at what happened to cause people to change their identities. And I'm maybe simply so out of the loop at this point that I don't even understand why that should be done. But if there's a good reason, somebody might tell me. Maybe after the talk, if you want to. Obviously, need education.
Yeah, there's something that I can add to what John Shepard just said. Because I studied the mainland person, and there's a phenomenon I think is pretty obvious, and it happened after democratization, increasingly so. That because in Eastern Taiwan, we just talked about a lot of marriages between retired, underprivileged veterans and local indigenous women, and the second, especially the third generation, but increasingly they identify themselves as indigenous people rather than mainlanders. But for the parents, it's totally different. That is very, very obvious, and you can say that the kind of sort of cultural pride, or this is how, because people want to be identified, as because just for the reason that indigenous people, they really just become the symbol of Taiwanness. And you can say that, and this is back to Steve's question, right? You can say that's a form of cultural appropriation, but as we heard, that there is this process of negotiation. The other thing that I want to sort of, so two other things. One is that I recently sort of reviewed a whole bunch of articles for International Journal of Taiwan Studies. If you guys want, maybe some of you also sit on that committee, right? I think Scott Simon wrote an extremely fascinating, article actually on all of these issues. And so, if Steve want to sort of catch up, I mean, that's definitely so it's in the International Journal of Taiwan Studies. It's mainly about the indigenous transitional justice, but he does talk about the issues that we talked about very broadly and in some of the minute details that you guys might want to learn about. And so my final point is, I think this is my question for Niki. Like, it has to do with sort of a use of indigeneity on a more international level, since we're now talking about connection to the outside world, the oceanic point of view. The thing is that, what do you think about, because there's a contrast. I think, Scott Simon's article actually also pointed out that contrast, that Taiwan is actually not a recognized nation, but international. But it's indigenous community that participate in a lot of these, like, international organizations. And it seems that, this is sort of used as some kind of cultural diplomacy. And I know, this is not, sometimes, some of it is actually what you're doing, right? Basically, it's organic, it's, from the people themselves, and sometimes they're state directed and there's just state funding. So, so Niki, again, I'm not an expert in this area. I just want to, let's see if you can talk a little bit about this dynamic and how your assessment of how, in the Taiwan's indigeneity or the promotion of this actually sort of help Taiwan internationally or not help, or in terms of what people actually participate and think about. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, you mentioned obviously about recognition and the Taiwan Indigenous people are recognized by the UN as an Indigenous group. So there is a route in. So one area where I've looked at is because of this work on Barkov is that Taiwan could look towards having UNESCO cultural heritage, but they couldn't apply for it through Taiwan, could not apply for this, but there are ways in which that it can bypass. Other places do have cultural recognition. Baoangong in near Daodaochen, around that area does have a UNESCO. I don't think it's intangible cultural heritage, but it has a form of cultural heritage. I don't know what it is, but there is a recognition a cultural recognition for that temple. I just can't remember what it is now, but I was exploring the way in which that through UNESCO, it could do this through Indigenous people applying for this. It is a complicated thing in terms of just ways in which that it would go about doing that. The other area of particular interest is with future displacement of Pacific Islanders. And to look at Taiwan changing its refugee law to bring these islanders in as part of this. If this is the homeland of Austronesian people, then there is the scope to bring Austronesian people that will be futurely displaced. This is another area, and a colleague of mine, one of the 5 Taiwan specialists within the university, Lara Mameso, who works on migration, she's just finished a book that's kind of exploring the possibility about how perhaps Taiwan should be relooking or rethinking about its refugee policy to potentially accommodate that in the future. And so there is a gate, once again, there could be this, if we're looking at Indigenous as a way of having that international recognition, then there has to be a return upon that. And that's what she was exploring in her work.
Yeah, thank you, Niki. Learned so much from the presentation. Please allow me to ask very nice question. First of all, about the archive. You mentioned that the British missionaries that were expelled at the end of the Why was that? Was like relationship between them and the KMT, or
So this was before the war. So this was
before the Japanese.
The Japanese. Oh, yeah. So early 1940s, or it wasn't just the missionaries; it was all British people who were there, which was mainly the mission.
Right. Before the Japanese, okay, because I thought maybe I heard it wrong. You mentioned the 1940s.
So when they came back, so there was that dark period. So basically, there is no archive in the UK from the moment that they left to when they came back 6 years, 7 years later.
Right.
But when they came back, it was nothing like what it was before they left. But actually, it wasn't like nothing happened. It's just that when you are, particularly in either in Tainan or in Taipei, the Yangmingshan, the seminary and the archive there, it has all this material which, so interestingly, was just now being done there. They were continuing to document in very much the same kind of way, even though that no longer exists.
Right. So there's a sort of how to avoid during the Japanese period. Then they were allowed to come back.
Right up until 1940. So there was antagonism, particularly around schooling. So that was an area where we begin seeing. But initially, so in 1895, the archives talk very much about welcoming the Japanese, thinking that it would be easier than it was working with the Qing. And then it started to get more complicated, particularly around mission-led schools. And now obviously the Japanese were looking at educating in Japanese, whereas the mission schools were still doing it in local language. And then hospitals was another area where Japan wanted greater control over health. And so mission hospitals there was an antagonism between the hospitals as well. But then 1940 is when, they talk very much about leaving. And many of them have been there for 30, 40 years. So they talk very much about sad to leave, and particularly of people that they were working with. But then it all just goes quiet, and then there's just nothing. And then it comes back in 1947, but then they're talking has very, very different kinds of flavors and opportunities where they're talking about this. And then it really is just centered around 1 or 2 people being there, not the extent it was before.
Why would they were the allies, why would they need to be expelled?
Yeah.
But my kind of more substantial question is I'd really be curious to learn more about you mentioned about the schooling and children, like making Christian children, and the sort of broadly my interest, morality
and in this case, identity and broadly construed, because especially in these hyper-politicized contexts like these days or in earlier periods, is always a contested domain, right? How to educate children and become good person according whatever standard these powers are defining and trying to cultivate, mold those personhood. And because I'm not a historian, but I'm interested in these different periods, and there aren't many. Because I went to Taipei last year, and I was hoping to kind of get a bit more materials on the martial law period in terms of political socialization. And I went to, I think, 进士所 at Academia Sinica. I was like, I think they don't allow people to just copy out. You have to sit there and looking through their archives about anything related to child or childhood. And it's mostly 中文社, the very similar propaganda of this KMT and CCP. But, you know, they you kind of send representative children to sing songs and perform, and then sort of show the correct ideology and all that. But I'm always interested in learning more and getting myself educated in the history of Taiwan and other forms of materials relating to that larger problem. And I'm actually going to London in January to the LSE. So is it open?
You just go in. It's one of the 5 research libraries, so you'll go into the front desk. They do. It may also be good to give the archivist a head start to let them know that you're arriving. If you send me an email, I'm happy to do the introduction. We talk every now and then. As I said, it's not, I don't work on the collection. It was really a project that I did whilst I was a PhD student, and I haven't really done anything more with that. But the archivist is, she's still there, and every now and then we meet for a coffee when I'm in London. So I'd be happy to make that introduction. There's definitely a lot around education, but one of the interesting things is that the late 19th century, the girls' schools, for example, were dominated by Indigenous girls. They weren't Han girls. They weren't at school. So when we are looking at kind of literacy rates, actually were higher amongst Indigenous girls than there were non-Indigenous girls. And so a lot of the roll calls and all of those are within our archive. It was, for me, I had that one task was to identify any single time that you mentioned Indigenous, to put that as an index and look for putting together in the book the things I found the most interesting. And so that was it. But I was aware that they had this stuff, but I don't know how useful.
No, you haven't talked yet.
It's true, but your hand was up first.
Well, okay. I want to identity thing. I mean, I totally agree that, missionaries bribe people. But, they don't see it, they don't see it cynically. I mean, the current, and if you go into any any Aboriginal village in Taiwan, the most prominent building is the church, and you go inside and there's this wonderful fusion of Christian mythology and native mythology. You go into a Han church in Taiwan, and it's just so austere and concrete and very uninteresting. But you go into the indigenous churches, and even the Catholic ones. There's a Catholic deacon in Taiwan who has a series of paintings of the history of the world. And it starts from when the Taiwan emerged from the sea, right off the particular coast, and it goes through, so and so and so and so. At some point, Jesus comes in, about 2,000 years ago, and then they get fused, and then come the Dutch, and then come the Japanese, and then come the Chinese, and then comes the democratization. But it's all told in the visual mode of traditional, at least neo-traditional, Taiwan paintings with a lot of babushka and a lot of these other mythical animals and so forth. And so it's really it's from these people's standpoint, it's their church.
Right.
It's not an outside thing. You know, the church is a episode in the history of the Taiwan from the time they emerged from the sea to, you know, right now. And it seems like this is another example was on the Lanya, just passed away, just died about 2 months ago. Xiaobang Lamaran, the preacher of the church in get the name of the village, but anyway, his son is Xiaobang Lamaran, the first down PhD. And you know, I bought a set of his books. I'm getting to the UW library, but he's written about 4 books that you know, and he is an ordained Presbyterian minister, and he's written all sorts of stuff about Taiwan's history and legends and myths and rituals and all this kind of stuff. So that it's a really, to me, a really interesting story of having taken Christianity and absorbed it or merged it with this tradition visually and literature and everything else. And it's very different from the Protestant churches, the Han Protestant churches, where a Christian is sort of, you know, consciously and distinctly, you know, we don't go to the temple, we don't buy, we don't hold incense, we don't do any of this stuff. We're different. But for the indigenous peoples, it's emerging rather than a boundary drawing.
Yeah, and it's something we see across the as well. So churches in Papua New Guinea, for example, are very much similar, and we see these amongst Methodist churches in Fiji, Tuvalu as well. You see very much an absorption of both elements rather than a rejection of one.
And I think the Indigenous Presbyterian Church and the Taiwan Presbyterian Church are institutionally separate. Is that right?
I think it comes under the same institution. It's still the Taiwan.
Much to do with each other.
No, but I think there is this like autonomy of the way in which that they run by the church, and typically the kind of the minister is also the head of the village as well. So they're working on this kind of dual roles. So
So it's kind of a change back to something, well, the ocean part of what you spoke about, and then your invitation or command or whatever it was at the end to reimagine that we were starting over from scratch.
Yeah.
So, I mean, honestly, that gave me a headache as soon as you said it. I'm not going to do that. But I think of how I've changed. The ocean or water is a big part of how I changed it. And it actually kind of goes back to my first fieldwork, which didn't have any of this kind of thing in mind. But when I started looking more historically at that ghost festival that I wrote about, there's this wonderful Mackay missionary description of the ghost festival in Sancha, where he talks about these camphor burners who come in out of the mountains and take a rather violent role in the ritual. So then I started looking at, like, who? What are these people? And camphor, once you start looking seriously at Taiwan's economy in the 19th century, it's a major world exporter of camphor, of rice. It's a major importer of seasonal labor to deal with tea, of which it's the major exporter to the U.S. around the U.S. Civil War period. It's an oceanic place, so that even in Sancha, viewed completely as a continental, if I can say it about an island, place by me at that time, it's the world economy is playing a really important role in the 19th century in what's going on. And in some ways, that's true back to the beginning. I mean, think of Zheng Chenggong as not as the guy who took over Taiwan or the Ming rebel or something, but as the pirate slash trader slash smuggler who was dominating waterways between Southeast Asia and Japan. Right? And there's a bunch of people like that. So I think what's changed for me is water.
Right.
I mean, there's a maritime literature, maritime China literature already. This is if we don't play the let's reduce this to Taiwanese identity game, right? Then this Taiwan story kind of fits that. But there's other water we're thinking about. Think of Skinner. Skinner's regional systems is actually about water.
Yeah.
Inland water, but water, the flows of water. So for him, water makes communication easier, so we get these cultural unities around areas where it's easier for water to flow. He ignores the places where the water screws everything up. Wetlands, deltas. And so, I'm working now in the Yangtze River Delta, a very hard place to penetrate if you're trying to control it, because it keeps the land keeps moving on you, the people keep moving on you. It's as sort of Jim Scott or opposite Jim Scott, both at the same time place, right? It's like those upland places that he does write about, in the sense of being inaccessible, difficult to govern, easy to pirate from, and yet the opposite sort of place in some way. So there are all these effects of water that we don't normally think about. Even, people drowning in sunshine.
Right.
The way water flows because of that mountain range that dominates, so that a placid, shallow river can become a raging torrent in like minutes. There's all of this, a different optic.
Yeah.
That I think is quite different from what all of us had in mind when we were first doing field work that we've maybe learned since then.
Yeah, and it's really interesting you said this, because we had an event on not so long ago, but because another one of my colleagues but works on eco literature, is there's a lot of writing at the moment of Taiwan and the lack of water, where the rivers are not as large as they used to be. Absolutely. That's why I've made a note there, because I think, water in its abundance or a lack of it, it's all conversations around water and the importance that it plays. So thanks for that insight. And I won't press you any further if you could start it all again.
Exactly. It is. Jungle. Yeah.
One more question. We got time for one more?
I was just going to make a comment. We talk about the Austronesians going out, and what you talk about the paper mulberry, but the archaeologists found these jade things that are being produced in the east coast of Taiwan and traded south into the Philippines, and there's some really fabulous objects that have been found. So that's going out, but there are thousands of years of Austronesian history on the island of Taiwan. And the outward migration is one thing, but it's highly possible that, especially for the littoral people, the Soraya, the Ami, the Kuvala, the coastal people, have been affected by reverse kind of movements of Austronesians from the Pacific or nearby areas back into Taiwan. So I think that always gets left out of, we're talking thousands of years of history. And, there were these examples in the Sung of Austronesian people, navigating the straits and attacking Trandro.
Mm-hmm.
So, we have really interesting little tidbits of, Austronesian history and trade that is we shouldn't forget about.
No, absolutely. And I think it's a really important point. I think the settlement of Lanyu Island is a reverse one. So it was settled from the Batanes, not to the Batanes Island.